Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today is May 7th, and I am headed to Gettysburg in a few hours for the Gettysburg Film Festival. I'm hoping to meet many of you there. It's going to be a fantastic experience for all involved, and we have scheduled it for this week because it's the 80th anniversary of VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, May 8th officially. And so I thought it would be appropriate to record this video as I'm getting ready to leave and talk a little bit about VE Day, specifically Germany's 3 surrenders in Europe. This is a video from Mark Felton Productions, who we've taken a look at before and does a fantastic job with all things World War II. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. Before we dive into today's video, I do want to give a big shout out and a thank you to Nikolay, and I hope I pronounce the name of your town right, in Skotterund in Norway. Nikolay signed up about a month ago as a patron, and I could not be happier about that. I really appreciate it. Let's dive in. Monty.
Today is the 78th anniversary of the surrender of Nazi Germany on the 8th of May 1945. But the day now known as Victory in Europe, or VE Day, was the culmination of not one, but 3 surrenders by Germany that finally ended most of the fighting in Europe. Following Adolf Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker on the 30th of April 1945, the war in Europe continued unabated.
So I was just there a couple weeks ago. I know some of you have been there as well. If you've never been to Berlin, I highly recommend it. Lots of incredible history there. But it's almost within sight of the Brandenburg Gate. You have right there in kind of a short area, you have the Reichstag, the Brandenburg Gate, and then you have the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, which is very powerful to see. And then right almost across the street from the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe is the former site of Hitler's bunker near the Reichschancellery. And right now it's actually it's part of a parking lot for an apartment complex. And I found myself, and we were talking about this on the tour, just kind of thinking out loud, what would Hitler and Goebbels, who both died at the bunker, what would they have thought of this massive memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe being right next to the place where they spent their final moments?
Governmental power was transferred, as per Hitler's last will and testament, to 2 leaders. Hitler's propaganda minister, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, who died right outside the bunker as well, in the Führer bunker with Hitler to the end, and the head of the Navy, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was based in northern Germany.
And you might wonder, well, what about guys like Himmler and Hermann Goering? Well, they'd kind of fallen out of favor by that point. They were looking to save their own skin, whereas a guy like Dönitz was, a soldier, and so he's a sailor, but he's going to stick with his job to the end. And Goebbels was a guy who was always a fanatic.
Goebbels became Reich Chancellor for 1 day. He attempted to negotiate a ceasefire in Berlin with the Soviet command, but with German resistance almost at an end, the Soviets saw no point to it and demanded unconditional surrender instead. Goebbels chose suicide on the afternoon of the 1st of May 1945 after being in power for less than 24 hours.
Yeah, and he and his wife murdered their children first before he basically did a murder-suicide with him and his wife. I know that just by saying those words, I probably just demonetized this video. But anyway, obviously, there's a whole different mindset by the Germans toward the Soviets than toward the Western Allies. There's a number of reasons for that. First of all, the nature of the leadership of the Soviets versus the Western Allies. But we also have to take into consideration the absolute wrath that had been poured out on the Soviets by the Germans, by the army, by these Einsatzgruppen, and and during the Holocaust. These people, the Germans viewed as lesser humans. They're less than human. And so they really just were awful toward the Soviets as they conquered territory. And so now the favor is being returned by the Soviet army as it marches into Germany. And so the Germans tried really hard to negotiate separate pieces with the Western Allies and with the Soviets, hoping that they could get the Western Allies to kind of put a stop to all of it because they knew they were going to get nowhere with the Soviets.
Berlin surrendered the next day, 2nd of May.
The Reichstag.
However, the surrender of Berlin made very little difference to German forces elsewhere. 3 things were occurring. Firstly, in many parts of Europe, German occupation forces were doing no actual fighting and were simply awaiting the outcome of events. For example, German troops still occupied the British Channel Islands and a few ruined French port cities like Dunkirk.
And they occupied parts of the Netherlands still.
Huge garrisons remained in control of Denmark and Norway and parts of the Netherlands.
So you see the food drops here. If you've seen the movie or the TV show Masters of the Air, you see part of what was called Operation Manna, I think, by the British, and it was called Operation Chowhound by the Americans. And so sometimes gets referred to as Operation Manna Chowhound. And what it was you took all these bombers, these B-17s, but I think probably also some B-24s, and Liberators, and they were Liberators, and British bombers, and they're flying in massive food drops to people who have been occupied for half a decade at this point.
Secondly, many German forces were moving west against orders to try and surrender to the British or the Americans to avoid Soviet captivity.
Which any reasonable person would have done in that situation.
These movements would lead to a series of rather chaotic surrenders that served to antagonize Stalin, as the Allies had agreed only to Germany's unconditional surrender. And thirdly, some German forces were fighting hard in the east to avoid capture by the Soviets, including the area southwest of Prague in Czechoslovakia, north of Berlin, and in Austria and parts of northern Yugoslavia.
So it was really important for the Allies to be on the same page when it came to these things. And so there had been an agreement between the Allies, including the Soviets, that it would be a joint surrender. It would be all or nothing. It would be unconditional surrender, which means you just surrender and you lay down your arms and then we'll stop fighting. But if you try to request terms like we want certain guarantees, you're not going to get it.
And of course, resistance did continue to both British and American forces in Western Germany, although mostly without the ferocity and determination of those forces facing the Soviets. In fact, US and Soviet forces had met at Torgau on the Elbe River on the 25th of April 1945, cutting Germany in two.
And the Elbe River is the river that runs down through kind of eastern Germany, where Berlin is.
Which had led Hitler to divide command of the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, between north and south. In the south, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had assumed command, while in the north, Grand Admiral Dönitz commanded all remaining forces in northwestern Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark and Norway, and had also been appointed, following Hitler's death, Reich President.
And these were two positions that had been two separate positions, the Chancellor and the President. What had happened was they had combined those two after Paul von Hindenburg dies. Hindenburg was the President, Hitler was the Chancellor. When Hindenburg dies, they combine the two into the Führer, into one position. So now, Hitler is kind of saying, okay, well, now that I'm going to be gone, we can go back to two positions again.
Dönitz was now the official leader of Nazi Germany. Dönitz had announced by radio that the war would continue. He knew Germany's perilous position and that German military resistance was hopeless, but he was by now running Operation Hannibal, the mass evacuation of German troops and civilians from the Baltic areas, which were being overrun by Soviet forces which were committing terrible atrocities in their wake. Dönitz needed more time to remove hundreds of thousands of Germans from the threatened areas.
And one of these, I think it's probably the worst ship disaster in world history, is when one of these massive evacuation ships is going to be sunk by the Soviets.
Dönitz had earlier been shown a copy of the Allied plan for the post-war occupation of Germany, which clearly delineated each nation's areas. He therefore decided to buy time by permitting local German surrenders, determining that as many German troops as possible would surrender into the hands of the Western Allies without ordering a general surrender, ensuring that resistance continued against the Soviets.
So, in hindsight, you might think, well, why would you keep fighting and why would you let people keep dying when you know you can't win? Well, I mean, at this point, much like what's happening with the Allies, everybody's thinking about the post-war world. Everybody's thinking about what comes next. The Allies have been operating under those kind of guidelines. They had been operating under what was going to come next. They had already been planning all of that out, and so that is determining where attacks are happening and which way armies are moving, all with an eye to the post-war world.
The British 21st Army Group was powering through weak German defences in northern Germany. On the 3rd of May 1945, Dönitz sent a delegation led by Admiral von Friedeburg to the British 2nd Army headquarters at the Villa Mölking in Hechlingen. Accompanying von Friedeburg was Rear Admiral Gerhard Wagner, a senior member of his staff, and General Eberhard Kinzel, who represented Field Marshal Ernst Busch, who commanded Army Group Northwest, which was actually doing most of the fighting against the British and Canadians in the area. Von Friedeburg's delegation were taken by cars to Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery's tactical headquarters, located in command caravans on Lüneburg Heath. Monty, ever the showman, made the Germans wait for quite a long time beneath a flagpole that was flying the British Union flag until he finally emerged from his caravan to meet them.
I'm not a huge Montgomery fan, but I have to really appreciate that and give the man his due for that one. That's pretty awesome.
"Who are these men?" he snapped at an interpreter in his nasal voice. On being given their names and ranks, Monty said dismissively, "I've never heard of them. What do they want?" A letter was produced from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief.
This is fascinating footage. I mean, to have footage of all of this happening, and this is because Montgomery waits, obviously, then that's going to give an opportunity for them to, and this is probably Montgomery as well, hey, make sure you get this all on camera.
Of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Armed Forces High Command.
Keitel, yeah.
Keitel offered to surrender Army Group Vistula.
And I believe Keitel's one of the guys who's going to end up being executed after the Nuremberg trials. And one other little interesting fact about Keitel, he was actually related to Mrs. Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer's wife, the man who helped develop the atomic bomb.
The 500,000 or so troops that were still fighting the Soviets, and who were mostly engaged north of Berlin, on the assumption that these troops would be taken prisoner by the British. Montgomery refused, saying that this was a Soviet zone and therefore a Soviet matter. Montgomery told von Friedeburg that he could only entertain the surrender of German forces on his own northern and western flanks, in other words, in the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and Denmark. A good lunch was served to give the Germans time to digest Monty's offer before a second meeting was held in his command tent. Von Friedeburg said that he didn't have the authority to negotiate such a surrender. He would return to Grand Admiral Dönitz's headquarters at the Mervik Naval Academy in Flensburg to discuss the matter. A British officer, Major Richard O'Brien, and an escort went with von Friedeburg to Dönitz's headquarters. On the afternoon of the 4th of May 1945, von Friedeburg's party returned back through British lines and was escorted to Montgomery's headquarters. Monty called a press conference. After briefing the press about what was happening, Monty had the German officers paraded once more in front of the Union flag for photographs.
Monty is always the showman. He's always thinking about the PR of all of this, and he's not alone in that. We shouldn't give him uniquely a hard time. There are plenty of people. George Patton's a great example from the American Army. There are others, but he understands this is history. And history is unfolding by the minute. And thankfully, in Monty's case, he had all of this stuff documented.
Monty then took von Friedeburg to his caravan and asked him in private if he would sign the surrender document, which he agreed to do. The entire German delegation then went into Montgomery's large tent and at 6:30 p.m. signed the instrument of surrender. It would come into force at 8 o'clock British time on the morning of the 5th of May 1945.
So this is several days before what we call VE Day. And it just goes to show you that in war, there's never like a clean break moment. There's always kind of a crescendo to it. The American Civil War, everybody talks about Lee's surrender at Appomattox on April 9th, but you have armies in the field for another month or more after that. Don't see him on with his glasses very often.
After General Admiral von Friedeberg, it is Infantry General Kinzel who signs. For them too, a long road is ending. A road that started with conquest and ends now in utter defeat. Field Marshal Montgomery. He signs not only for himself, for his armies, for England and her allies. He signs also for all those who ever marched with him and fell at 100 barricades, who died for all of us, that with peace we may build a wiser world.
Although German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands and Norway had surrendered, the war still continued elsewhere, and Dönitz and his government remained in being, at Prime Minister Winston Churchill's insistence, left in control of a large area of northern Germany near the Danish border, with thousands of troops still under arms, and with characters like Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler in attendance. Churchill's reasoning was that Dönitz's government would be better placed to deal with the surrender of German forces and their disarming, saving the British the job. But
so it's kind of interesting because later on Patton's going to get into a lot of trouble for leaving people who had been members of the Nazi Party in positions as he saw it, because there was nobody else who could effectively do the job. There's some debate about whether that was the right move or not, but yeah, you can't just leave a power vacuum. And so to a degree, at least until you can get in there and kind of start dealing with all of it, you've got to leave people in place. You can't just usurp all their authority.
Controversially, it left a Nazi government in existence until the 23rd of May 1945, long after VE Day, the subject of one of my earlier videos, link in the end screen. Grand Admiral Dönitz next ordered von Friedeberg to try and negotiate a partial surrender of German forces that were still fighting the Americans. Such a move would enable Dönitz to surrender in the west while continuing the war in the east to try and prevent the Soviets from gaining more territory in Europe, and also to continue Operation Hannibal, the mass evacuations by ship through the Baltic. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was very concerned that local surrenders such as that made by Montgomery with von Friedeberg would damage the Western Allies' relationship with the USSR.
So Eisenhower's got a very different role than somebody like Montgomery does. Montgomery's a field commander of troops on the ground. Eisenhower's got to be not only the theater commander, but he's also got to be a politician. And that's one of the reasons why Ike was perfect for this job. Ike has never had a field command. Like this is a guy who, going all the way back to World War I, had always been a staff officer, but he excelled in that. And he was the perfect politician who could deal with the likes of Churchill and Roosevelt, but also deal with George C. Marshall back in Washington, and also deal with the Soviets, and deal with de Gaulle, and deal with the Dutch, and deal with the Polish, and all of these other things that are happening. And so while Montgomery has the freedom to do something like accept local command surrender of German command, Eisenhower's got to think big picture, and he doesn't have the freedom to be able to do that.
As unconditional German surrender to all Allied powers had long been agreed to. Eisenhower therefore informed General Alexei Antonov of the Soviet High Command and promised him that he would press the Germans for complete unconditional surrender on all fronts, that is, including the Eastern Front. A Soviet delegation was dispatched under Major General Ivan Susloparov to take part in the negotiations to ensure Eisenhower kept his word. On the 5th of May 1945, von Friedeberg attempted to fly to the Allied headquarters at Reims, a city the Americans called Reims in World War II.
Reims, yeah. And this is where the surrender, at least in the West, is going to take place, is in Rheims. And Reims, whatever you might call it. French pronunciations are always hard for we English speakers. That's why a town in Belgium that is pronounced Yper by the Dutch and Ypres by the French, it was called Wipers by the British.
To meet Eisenhower, but his aircraft was diverted by bad weather to British-occupied Brussels. The Germans were then driven 200 kilometers by the British to the meeting at the Reims Technical College. They met General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. Von Friedeburg told Smith that the Germans were prepared to surrender forces on the Western Front. Smith informed Eisenhower, and Eisenhower said that he must insist that the surrender be on all fronts. Eisenhower also threatened to stop taking fleeing German prisoners into Western Allied lines, meaning the thousands who daily were leaving soon-to-be Soviet territory for US and British occupation areas. He would simply close the borders and leave them to the tender mercies of the Soviets. Von Friedeburg sent a signal to Dönitz for his advice. Reich President Dönitz tried a different tack. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the OKW,
and Jodel's another guy who's going to be executed after the Nuremberg trials,
Armed Forces High Command, flew to Reims to assist in negotiations with General Smith, arriving on the 6th of May 1945. Jodl explained that only surrender in the West was acceptable to the German government. Smith told Eisenhower that he believed Dönitz was stalling for time, which indeed he was.
Yeah, he absolutely was. And if any of us were in Dönitz's position, we probably would have done the same thing.
Eisenhower demanded unconditional surrender, or he would halt any further negotiations with the Germans. Jodl sent a signal to this effect to Dönitz. The Reich President gave his permission to surrender early on the 7th of May.
Didn't have a choice, really. I mean, he's put in an impossible situation at that point.
At 2:41 a.m. on the 7th of May, General Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces in a large packed room at Reims Technical College. Eisenhower remained in a separate room, and General Smith, British Admiral Sir Harold Burr, and Soviet General Suslopurov also signed, along with French General François Servet. The agreement would come into force at 11:01 p.m. Central European Time the next day, 8th of May 1945, giving the Germans quite a large period of grace. The Germans were escorted from the room, and the Allied representatives celebrated with champagne drunk from mess tins. Eisenhower now met Jodl, von Friedeburg, and German Major Wilhelm Oxenius, Jodl's aide, in his office.
So notice what happened there. Eisenhower isn't going to meet with any of these guys until after the surrender has been signed. Again, this is all theater. This is all calculated. This is all being well thought through about how this process is going to go.
He asked them if they understood the surrender terms. When they replied that they did, Eisenhower then asked them if they were prepared to carry them out. They agreed. They then bowed slightly and left the room. The Germans now had 45 hours to complete Operation Hannibal. The last convoy left Libau, now in western Latvia, on the 8th of May 1945, shortly before the surrender became law, carrying 15,000 German soldiers and civilians. In total, Operation Hannibal saw the successful evacuation of almost 2 million troops and refugees. The problem now was the Soviets. Although Suslopurov had signed the surrender document, he had only done so on the agreement that if Stalin required a further signing ceremony, they would have to take part. The British, Americans, and French agreed to his terms. Unsurprisingly, Stalin did indeed want such a ceremony to take place, and demanded a ratification of the ceremony at Reims to be staged in Soviet territory. And where better than the destroyed capital of the Third Reich, Berlin, then deep inside the Soviet occupation area. The Soviet headquarters in devastated Berlin had been set up by Marshal Georgy Zhukov in the rather less damaged suburb of Karlshorst at the captured German Army Engineering School. So the third German surrender was organized for the 8th of May 1945. Eisenhower would again not attend in person. Instead, his deputy, as Supreme Allied Commander, British Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, would be the senior Allied representative, along with US General Karl Spaatz, British Admiral Sir Harold Barrah, and French General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny.
So here again, this is an opportunity then, since if you're going to make us do it again, let's let the British shine on this one. And so the senior representative is going to be from the British Army.
The Soviets also demanded that the most senior German officers appear to sign the document, who were all at Flensburg with the Dönitz government. In accordance with Soviet wishes, Field Marshal Keitel, representing the army, Admiral von Friedeburg, representing the navy, and Colonel General Stumpf, representing the Luftwaffe, were delivered by US C-47 aircraft to Tempelhof Airport in Berlin.
Still there, actually. You drive into Berlin, you fly into the Berlin airport, which opened in, I think, 2020. And then as you're coming into the center of the city, you actually go by the Tempelhof airport. It's really cool to kind of see the big field where that airport was still open and not built on, and some of the buildings from the airport are still there.
Soviet vehicles then transported the 3 senior officers and their aides to the Army Engineering School at Karlshorst. Soviet Marshal Zhukov, the victor of Berlin, would represent the USSR. Over food and vodka, it was agreed who would sign the document.
Of course, vodka.
Air Chief Marshal Tedder would sign both as Eisenhower's deputy and as British representative. Zhukov would of course sign for the Soviet Union, and General Spaatz for the US. And
I always thought Zhukov just looked like a guy that basically was a bear that had been turned into a human being.
Tassigny for France.
So actually it's kind of fascinating that the senior American and the senior British representatives are both from the Air Force. Karl Spaatz is an Air Force guy, or Army Air Corps, or U.S. Army Air Forces at that point, I guess. It underwent a few different names.
It was also occasioned by the translating of the Reims document into Russian. Finally, the meeting was opened in the early hours of the 9th of May 1945, the German surrender having already occurred at 11:03 p.m. on the 8th of May 1945. So when Zhukov ordered the German representatives to enter the room, they did so as representatives of the Germany that had already surrendered. Yep. The 3 German generals entered with their aides, Field Marshal Keitel casting baleful glares at the Allied representatives. A mad crush of Allied reporters and photographers threatened to turn the entire event into a circus, and Keitel in particular looked extremely annoyed, a monocle ground into his left eye, none of his old arrogance diminished by his present situation. The 3 Germans each signed. By 12:20 a.m. on the 9th of May, the Allied representatives had also signed.
French General de Lattre de Tassigny. It is over. The war in Europe is ended.
The Germans were ordered from the room. The German delegates to the 3 surrender ceremonies met differing fates. Admiral von Friedeburg was arrested by British forces when the Dönitz government was dissolved on Churchill's order on the 23rd of May 1945. He committed suicide the same day using a cyanide capsule. Field Marshal Keitel and Colonel General Jodl were both arraigned before the Nuremberg trial and found guilty. Both officers were hanged in 1946.
So kind of an interesting aside as well to that execution. When they executed those guys, it was a really small trap door that they were falling through. And a lot of them hit their head on the way down. And in particular, I'm not going to show it, but if you look at the photos that were taken afterwards, especially of a guy like Keitel, just blood everywhere. And that's from the result of him hitting his head on the way down and then him struggling for like 20 minutes before he died. It was brutal stuff. All right, so that was good stuff. As always, he does a great job with everything, putting the information together. I hope we all learned a little something about that as we are celebrating VE Day this week. And I want to thank Daniel in Copenhagen. Is that Copenhagen? I guess that's Copenhagen, right? That's probably just the Danish spelling of it. Copenhagen, Denmark. Daniel, thank you so much. As well as Sheila in the UK. In King's Causeway in the UK. Thank you both so much. We just have this incredible support from all over the world that we're observing and thanking this week. So thanks so much for your support on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. Thanks for watching.